Okay, this is the second part of Lecture 5, which is all about carrying on the semantic design of the Faculty of Business website. This is where we got to. We've cleaned all the markup and made it semantic, removed all the embedded style sheet information, and we're left with this design. Now the next step is to basically decide what the logical content blocks are for this website. What this is all about really is looking at how many columns we have, whether there's a header, a footer, what those kind of logical shapes are inside the document. Now we will, unfortunately, have to add a little bit of markup back into the document to indicate what the names are of these logical shapes. And there's two ways of doing that. Either we can use an HTML element called div, and when we use a div, what we'll do is we'll wrap up an area of the document inside a div tag, and we'll give this area a name, and we'll use the attribute id, and we'll go id equals name in quotes, and that will be a unique name that uniquely identifies that area in the document. And you can see there's an opening part and a closing part, just like most tags in HTML. If we have a logical area which is inside another element, and the place where we most see this is inside a paragraph, for example, then we'll use a span. And a span is a great way of actually just marking out a tiny little logical area inside something else. And again, it's used in very much the same way as we use a div, in that it has an id and there's an opening part and a closing part. So let's have a look at the website and try and identify what those logical areas are. Well, there's obviously the banner right across the top of the page. We have a menu system on the left hand side. There's the central column, and then there's the column on the right. It's a standard 3-column layout. And right down the bottom we've got our footer. Now in fact, once upon a time we would have used names like this. We would have just made these names up. We would call them header, left menu, main, right menu, footer. But the trouble with those kinds of names is that they really are based on, placement. So if we name something left column, for example, what happens at a later point if we actually want to move that column so it's at the top or on the right? We may have hard coded that name into the CSS and the HTML, and we'll have to make loads of changes, or we leave it as it is, and the problem with that, of course, is it makes the site unmaintainable at a later point. That's not very good. So nowadays we try to come up with semantic names for things that are more meaningful. So avoid presentation and location-based names and try to think about names that actually describe what the actual content is. So there are some good names: branding, search, links, navigation, news, content, etc. It can be very difficult to come up with good names, but it's worth putting the effort in. So let's go back to the site and see what we've got here. Well, that top one, let's call it branding. Column on the left we can call navigation. Column in the middle, I'm just going to call it content main. It's not particularly brilliant, but I'm going to use that. Content sub-column, and then down the bottom we've got site information. Now in fact there are actually some sub areas inside here. So content main, I've decided that I'm going to have a sub news area, and then the column on the left I'm going to have a search input area and a badges area, and I've already talked about badges in the first part. Those are those images that indicate the kind of certification and branding that the Faculty of Business actually has. Now, to actually make those areas become real, we will have to add some markup back into the document. Now, it's a bit unfortunate because we spent a lot of time in the previous video taking all the markup out, but we will need a little bit of markup just to mark those areas out. So that's the head. Obviously nothing goes on in there. So here's the first part. This is the image, which is the banner at the top of the page. So we place a div tag around the image, and we simply go div id equals branding, and then the image goes inside. Here's the column on the left, and as we've seen before, that's a series of links, very clean. So we'll need to wrap that up with a div id equals navigation tag, and you can see we've got a closing div tag down the bottom. Now for the bit in the middle, we've got content main area, so I just put a div tag in there. And about halfway down, we have the table structure, which is the latest news table. So again, I'm going to need to put a div id equals news there. Now, column on the right, there's obviously lots of different parts there. So I've got div id equals search input, so that's the bit at the top, div id equals badges, and one thing to watch out for here is that I've got two closing divs. So all those div areas have to be closed at some point, so it's you need to be careful, particularly when you're placing one div inside another div, that you actually make sure that you close the divs. That of course applies to the central column as well. Down the bottom I've got div id equals site info when I close the div again. And you can see div id equals content sub is a wrapper that fits right round the whole thing, and that's why I've got two divs at the bottom. So that's it, that's all the markup that I really want to add at this stage. I'm not saying that we won't add a little bit more markup later on, we might have to when it comes to styling the file, but for the moment I think we'll just stick with that. That should be enough to actually style those individual columns. Obviously the next bit involves creating the overall CSS files and then normalizing it. So we'll actually think about having an external style file and start adding some parts to it to try and style the file correctly.